I'm going to read something to you. I will have to go through quite a lot of images and some films, hopefully. But I quite like normally to introduce the work that I show you with a quote by somebody else, but this time I'm actually quoting myself, just because it's maybe, I find it quite appropriate in some way to frame a lot of the work that isn't specifically talked about here, but I've written this for a publication that was produced after I came back from Northwest Greenland last year, and I made work and was asked to write for the catalogue, and it could have been anything at all. So I was kind of taking the approach to write a sort of little bit like a diary entry, but in hindsight after the trip. So this is really dedicated to the iceberg in the townhouse that you'll see images of. The piece is called "There's Always Something More Important," which probably reveals already the dilemma that I often find myself in when I not only try to find titles, but when I try to sort of explain what I do, which often kind of does one thing and does the opposite as well. With the argument of that there's always something more important, you can't quite pin down if it is the subject matter of dealing with the Arctic and ice as a subject, or if there's something that's actually personally more important than big issues like climate change, and it bounces back and forth. And I think you'll find that in a lot of the work there is that sort of underlying dilemma permanently there. Right. Lamentations, or the escape from the grid. This is, I can skip some things, otherwise it'll be too long. When traveling to and in the Arctic, the experience is one of heightened awareness of our limitations of seeing, perceiving, and getting a full view. The light, the open space, the sense of being up above the highest and maybe steeper bend of the globe is unfamiliar and overwhelming. On day one of my arrival in Karnak, I was told, you either love it here or hate it. People get addicted to the open space or frightened away and never come back. I long to go back. There won't be any northern lights to look out for. It's the wrong time of year, and anyway, we are too high up north, and I'm not really worried. I'm already paranoid that I come back with Arctic calendar pictures. Somehow, the sockets of my eyes suddenly seem to be too small, too close, too tight, and deep. I want to have a 360-degree vision. Needless to say, my camera lens frames and crops everything way too small and too tightly. I wanted to come this far to find and see a nature beyond landscape. Did I? Was it not inhabited and cultured continuously since 4,000 years, and therefore no longer untouched? And it takes a while to adjust, to take in how people live ordinary in their extraordinary ways, as they seem to have done forever. Then I realized that, of course, I wanted to see human relationships to the landscape and nature. The people up there are indigenous Inuit, occasional Danes, and international teams of scientists or camera crews, most likely making documentaries on climate change. Nature shows its real power with the weather and the climate, and the changes in both. The Inuit cope. They still live a hunting life, hunting culture. Subsistence hunting might not be 100%, but still there's a lifestyle that is hardy, resilient, and reluctant to give in to certain things, like snowmobiles, as much as willingness to adopt technologies as mobile phones and digital cameras. Before I went on my Arctic trip, I exchanged a few emails with a scientist on a marine expedition on board of the RRS James Cook in the Southwest Indian Ocean near Antarctica. After I got back from the hunting trip to Greenland, I also learned that even Mount Everest has G3 mobile reception since October 2010. There are only a few places on this planet that are not wired up, where the air might be free of communications and signals. This is one of those places, and maybe this was my incentive to go. In this sense, I truly managed to get away for 5 days anyway, and there were 6 of us. No reception, no grid, and no charge. Was it really just nature? They used to hunt on the sea ice for several more months per year in the past, and since years they cannot. So something is wrong and getting worse. I'm encouraged to speculate even more about what defines the line between nature and landscape, and my contemplations on how to define the contemporary sublime are ongoing. Perhaps it was a romantic act of breaking out of my own tradition of research that is looking at representations, photographs, paintings, and other data. Maybe this time I was seeking the subjective experience that was so fundamental to the romantic sublime of the 19th century. Thank you for being patient. But in a way, I just feel like it probably connects and sums up what I'm about to show you. Sorry, I have to go. I think most of you will be familiar with the quote that Thoreau gave us a long time ago about the wilderness in our heads. And I think there's this sort of ongoing quest with my work, trying to establish the impossibility to find it outside of your own head in some way. So I've compiled some slides, and I apologize already where I've just crammed in a lot of work as a sort of overview of what I've done in the past, such as this, where I've looked at maps a lot in the early stages of my projects, and have looked a lot at lines on the map, particularly obviously the equator and the Greenwich meridian, but also the 60th parallel north and various other lines that are significant. But looking at lines is sort of something that I have done continuously, and which is probably something that connects all these pieces. For example, these maps on the right-hand side, I asked people to draw maps from their memories and give me the drawings so I could make other maps. So it's a lot to do with a subjectivity versus an objectivity. Which is something that you can see up in the flight recorders, for example. I will probably keep bouncing around these two exhibitions that are in Brighton at this moment, but there is a lot underpinning a lot of my research to do with what is possibly objective and isn't everything subjective. How we interpret. For example, with found objects as well, I have made a lot of work where the physicality of an object becomes quite a sort of metaphor in the disruption that I might do, like cutting it into four. With the Bible is a very different thing than with the atlas. Cutting the atlas, I had to initially glue all the pages together to make it more like wood again. Pushing the atlas through a circular saw brings back the four directions of the sky. Cutting a Bible brings another layering of four books and a much more conceptual kind of four books layering about. Oh, that's a strange sentence, excuse me. Okay, I will quite quickly, I think, have to go through some of these where I've started looking at landscape sort of with the starting point of the maps, very clearly relating to images that I had, either paintings or postcards. And with, for example, the fog tank, I was looking at a Friedrich painting where I wanted the viewer to allow the recognition and sort of this image, but at the same time allow them to circumnavigate it and find a very different view on the back, where I think you can see it in the top image there, that the ship that's almost gone in the distant fog near the horizon becomes the foreground. So this timeline of a foreground, midground, background became really interesting to me, how that changes as much as we're moving around it and continuously shifts, and the background can be the foreground, etc. So there was a long string of pieces going alongside map pieces and film pieces where I made these, explored really different ways I could use water and chemicals in layers to sort of recreate a three-dimensional slice through weather conditions, or sunsets, or foggy mountains that I was looking at in the paintings. And every time I see the stills, I think I should really have movies here, because when you film it, you get much more of a sense of that refraction and distortion that happens with anything in water. I've kept this page in because often I get comments on sort of why don't you put those paintings in? I'm just flashing this past you to the kind of images, to show the kind of images that I was looking at, and what seems to unite them all is this sort of cropped view, or distorted view, or hidden views in the fog, or with the Hammershøis sort of going through different spaces and rooms. That in some way it kind of underlines the way that every image is kind of so very cropped and limited. I made one tank in quite a different scale, the forest tank, where somehow it seemed to be easier for people to sort of translate them into the space. With all the tanks, there's quite an important element of human residue in the landscape. So with the forest, you have a path going through it. With the mountain ranges, often you have tiny either masts or crucifixes or cairns or roads, tunnels, anything, but they are never untouched natures. So that's quite a unifying and important thing to remember. That even the light above something like Unrecallable Now is really important to me, how that disrupts and reflects. And in Japan particularly, where I showed it on the top left, it was a sort of strange conversation with the person who did the catalogue, that they wanted to Photoshop away the lights, and I said, no, it's really important. I need the reflection of the lamps. Especially in the context of a culture where maybe the illusion is accepted in a different way and taken as another reality, which is really interesting, but at the same time, kind of, it seemed to make no sense for me to take the lights out, because either you can look past them or you know they were there, because obviously you'd have to do quite a lot to make it real, I'd say. But there is always, in terms of an experience, that point where people who see these kind of things, partly because of the scale of them sometimes, and partly because of this sort of déjà vu remembrance of having been in a plane seeing something like this, or having been in front of a painting seeing something like this, there is still a sort of bit of the experience to start with where you allow your brain to sort of enter the space. And in many ways, I'm always trying to look after the bit that happens straight afterwards, where you sort of reminded of that back in the gallery, you're looking at art, and you're very aware of your presence in a space yourself. I will go through quite fast. These are just some examples of a body of work that went on for quite some time, but in some way it always existed parallel to other things. I've just sort of grouped them now. I was trying a lot of things with different numbers of tanks, or having with this one a tank that's separated inside itself to have a foggy outside and a clear inside. Looking at the window as the sort of thing that is both signifies obviously being a window and represents a window, but at the same time physically it's necessary to keep those two liquids apart. I'm actually just wondering, as I'm saying this is probably a heterotopia case, because it's neither one or the other, or it's both. Since I've called this project in the Regency Town House Heterotopias, I keep struggling with really finding a good definition. And here it is. Oops, sorry. This is an example where I wanted to see the fore-mid background properly separated, so that you could physically kind of get your head almost between the fore and the mid-ground, but from certain positions you would, well, certainly from the front, you'd have this sort of full image of the three layers, which doesn't seem to photograph as well as it should. Okay, thanks. then this piece I've left in there because obviously I've got the light boxes in the townhouse where the light boxes represent the center frame of these two videos. As the title describes quite clearly, well, I shall read it out to you again. Another day, simultaneous record of the rising and setting of the sun on two opposite locations on the globe, Southeast Australia and West Azores. So, because of the familiarity again of that image, I wanted to make a sunrise-sunset pair that was very particular and significantly different to all the sunsets you've ever seen, which came out of making a tank piece actually with the sunset where I set up two tanks with sort of a week in between that the chemistry would follow each other. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because like last week in that conversation about Germany and landscape and natures and so on, I did talk a little bit again about the stolen sunsets, and that was something I was certainly thinking about for some time, how landscapes were reappropriated in sort of the Nazi time in Germany, and how Caspar David Friedrich got sort of catapulted back into the conversation and abused in some way. And then there's a sort of, this would be a different lecture, I think, about Gerhard Richter reclaiming some of that, and me trying to also just replant this whole image of a sunset into maybe a consciousness that was quite damaged, let's say, in the 30s and 40s. And how that can sort of, how is that possible anyway? Or just sort of challenging it maybe, asking the question. So with this, I took a much more scientific kind of angle by working out precisely the 2 points that are antipodal where I can have a camera film the same sun from both sides. Kind of realizing that I've never worried about somebody looking at my sunset on the other side of the globe when they get up early and see the sunrise, but that's essentially what happened. So I had these two cameras in position when we filmed for 5 days, sort of not knowing what the weather was going to be doing. So in a way, that was, the project itself was physically and logistically quite hard to work out, and to get satellite telephones and all these things, but I wanted it to be a totally simple piece, so it's just two films running beside each other, or back to back, or opposite each other even. So let's see if I can, this is just a very short clip, and in fact, they're far too close together. I need to reset this. I just wanted to sort of have it to demonstrate that the sound is only the location sound. So I almost feel like I need to maybe skip past that one, but I suppose I started looking at different quotes in paintings, and the Ambassador painting by Holbein always fascinated me with that distorted skull. That it was a kind of visible from certain angles and then distorted into some weird blob most of the time. And I found it a challenge to sort of make something 3D that would just sort of separate that out from the painting and become this resin object. But I won't go into too much detail. This was a commission for a museum in Japan where it was a very unusual situation that we could sort of lay out the room and talk to the architect at the point of just building that museum, to sort of say, okay, I will do this and this, and they would place the doors and the lights and everything in the right place, which is quite extraordinary if you think about it. There was 10 artists doing different projects, and they managed to build a building around it somehow. So I decided to take the idea of the forest in the tank into a sort of life-scale situation, but without the water, because that would have been slightly challenging. It's 5 meters 50 tall, so it's cast, real trees cast in Kent, actually. And then the whole thing was sort of put together in London and then shipped to Japan. Yeah, sometimes I do wonder if that was not slightly mad, but it sort of makes me, I sort of forget why I wanted to see this, but it is obviously to do with the relationship of humans to the landscape, but the logistics were quite crazy because there was only a small lift, so all the trees had to be cut into bits and then reassembled up in the upper floor. I don't know, anyway. I shouldn't tell you this, but sometimes it's the first thing I think when I see this. Oh God! But what was important to me with this, that it was so hyper real and detailed that it was beyond a film set or a Disney prop. And in some way, maybe that's important to the iceberg. There had to be enough detail and sufficient quality in the casting that would sort of go past the stage set in some way. So with this, I had sort of pine cones and bits of rock, and everything was completely cropped in a perfect crop line to reenact the sort of cropped image of the photograph. Don't know if it's so visible on there, but now this piece goes back to a myth that fascinated me for quite some time, to do with Charles Babbage, actually. This is where the title of the show comes from. Charles Babbage wrote about the air capturing and recording forever all sounds ever made and ever spoken, and that there is this sort of ever-growing archive. And I just really loved that idea, but also at the same time the myth of Egyptian potteries recording sounds 4,000 years ago into the clay as they're turning the pots and spinning the continuous groove into the clay, that digital technology supposedly was able to read those pots and hear conversations from those days. So I made a piece to get this story out of my system and use the Babbage text as a voiceover. As a voiceover over 14 layers of different sounds that were all trapped in that clay, clearly.
The air itself is one vast
so it's a video with
whose
all those soundtracks
all that man has ever said or woman whispered,
laid onto it, pretending it was trapped in that
mixed with
recording.
The earliest, as well as the latest size of mortality.
So I would have had layers of the potter chatting to me while I was filming him, the sounds in the museum where this was exhibited,
the testimony of man's changeful
through
will.
the
But if the
sink pipes going down through the architecture, recording kids coming into the hallway, but I could hear it on the other end in the sink. It was kind of weird. It made me probably more aware of what happens with sound in architecture and in space and potentially in this story. But it carried through those kind of ideas that can carry through from projects like this into maybe that more military work that I've recently done.
Vast library.
I have to keep an eye on the time. Winterreise is something that I would have really, really liked to see as part of the festival here. There was a conversation at some point, because I have got sort of one strand in my work is very much to do with music and related to music and putting video to music or music to video, whichever way. For this particular project and for Kindertotenlieder, which is the next one, I worked with Opera North, and there was quite a sort of specific brief, but not. They would say, what about Schubert's Winterreise? But then leave it totally open to me if I wanted to do a sculpture or whatever. So I decided to make a film, or rather a set of 24 films, to dedicate a film to each song. It's a 24-song cycle, and take this sort of very melancholic material and put it into the much more sort of a calculated or semi-scientific context, where I would reenact a winter's journey in a very calculated way, as I would sort of follow a line, follow the 60th parallel north. The journeys I made went to Shetland Islands and to Oslo and surroundings, and St. Petersburg and around Russia for a bit. I would have loved to go all the way around the globe, but there was neither time or money to do it. In a way, it didn't really seem to matter, because I brought back a lot of footage and then assembled a 90-minute long film to go with Winterreise, and it was performed live many times, but also it existed as a kind of gallery piece. I'll just see if this is the challenge. Here we go. So what happens in the live performance of this, there would be a very large screen on the stage, and it was actually, I was working with Andre Foster Williams and with Christopher Gould, just two musicians that then we sort of came together as a team on this, where they performed in front of the moving image. I've put some clips on the sort of show reel, but I still think it probably might be a bit long. So I was continuously on this journey along the line of the 90th parallel. And these are obviously just sort of snippets. So the camera was normally either set up to point down the 60th parallel, or I was sort of moving in vaguely the right direction with it, like on this. So it's not all landscape, but most of it. I'm just going to speed this up a little bit. I really would like you just to see the last one, I suppose. This is the 24th song, where in the poems, the forlorn lover sort of ends up on a frozen lake and commits suicide, maybe. But that's a sort of it's kind of left open at the end. But I really enjoyed having that moment where I was on this frozen sea on my ship, sort of moving along, and everything was sort of moving, the ice was moving. But it seemed to represent that last song really well. It's my favorite anyway. Right. Another piece where I started with a set of 5 songs with Kindertotenlieder, and pretty soon decided I can't make this a live performance somehow. This has to be something more intimate and something much more sort of individually experienced, if you like. So it took me some time to decide what to do. So I ended up using 5 quite domestic settings for each song and making a moving image for each one to sort of have then the sound sort of separate individually in those rooms. It's kind of hard to really document it just with stills, but you get the sense down there. This was in the Colston Hall in Bristol. So there were like sort of stage sets, if you like, that you could walk into and get wrapped around with that particular song. But when you step outside, in between the 5 songs, you're sort of surrounded by this slightly uncomfortable and stressful cacophony of those 5 songs. And in some way, that was something I was really sort of wanting, that there was this sort of escape into the spaces, but and then this kind of very uncomfortable over exposure to 5 songs all playing at the same time. So it's a difficult thing to sort of, I found it very challenging to have this very sad material where you could not really introduce any irony or humor or anything. It just, it was interesting for me to see how the audience would respond as well. I had no idea this would really set quite a different response off than I anticipated, and in a good way, people would just burst into tears and be very grateful to me and come up to me and say, thank you, this is the first time I can sort of do this. And I found that really interesting in terms of exhibiting, or that distance that you have normally to the work, and just put it out. And I haven't done anything like that before or since, but it was certainly a project that should have been also here. To do with the childhood theme and so on. Anyway, I didn't really mean to say that, but it's a rather large installation. Back to landscapes. I mean, they have obviously played quite a part in the Kindertotenlieder. The piece I sort of did after quite some time of not making tongue pieces anymore, I allowed myself to go back and revisit the tanks, but as in a different form, as pairs, and as spherical pairs that resemble eyeballs to me. So everything in those eyeballs or glass spheres would be inverted and similar to the other tank pieces, sort of enlarged, and you always have this odd relationship to something like that because you feel outside of it but sucked into it at the same time. What was curious with the inversion was that obviously people walking around it on the other side, they would walk upside down. So the whole notion of having an upside down landscape kind of made sense in that entire upside downness. And what was also quite maybe predictable but odd, but when it was selected to be put into the Royal Academy into an exhibition that was dealing with climate change. So the exhibition was called Earth, Art in a Changing Climate. And of course, the wax was interpreted to be the ice caps, and these were the poles. And it was quite curious because I was so much looking at perception and how we see things and how we read into things, how that was totally reinterpreted for the context of that exhibition. So when I did this I just put these down for a talk with the students once when I wanted to be really sure they are eyeballs, and that my intention was still with that. But because I've made another couple of those types of sets since. But in a way, I just thought this is actually brilliant. This is perfectly misinterpreted, but this is precisely what I'm talking about with the subjectivity all the time, that there isn't an objective reading of such a thing. Everybody brings in their readings, and the curator knew precisely that I was constantly saying, no, these are eyeballs. Kathleen, these are not the poles, and that would be too linear and too one-dimensional to me. But in a way, because it sort of became quite an important image in that, and I felt better about it really in hindsight more and more that was actually exactly what I was trying to do, open it up to subjective readings. Not sure if this. Sorry. I will just play a bit of sound, but I think I'll just turn that down a little bit, otherwise but we can have a little bit of seagulls. Anyway, this is just a sound piece that you cannot see the speakers or anything. It's on Millennium Bridge, and I decided to totally not have any sculptural element other than the sound in a very, very cropped way. So I got hold of extremely directional speakers so that you would sort of walk into the soundscape and walk out of it with a very sharp crop. And because the location is actually almost, there are seagulls, it's almost believable that that sound could be there, but it's kind of just that bit too much and too loud. And I've layered recordings that I sort of took on the south coast in Cornwall and Devon and so on. I wanted that kind of experience of walking in and out of a sound zone where there's this really unusual sharp cut twice on the bridge. So often I watched people do this. The first time they would just kind of think they kind of hearing things, and the second time people would always sort of go back and discover what was going on. And in a way, that was interesting to watch, that it usually took the second time that there was really another sound, or people inevitably would be on their phones or headphones or something and miss it completely. But I think in terms of watching people walk around tank pieces or walk through this, it's always one of the elements that I find important to sort of witness and see how people respond and how they discover spatially what's there. In a similar way, I need to work my way up to the recent pieces now, aren't I, really? I will say the Hammersoe reference was sort of heading into a couple of pieces here where I worked with sightlines, looking through architectural spaces through doors and windows and seeing landscapes on screens, where I was just asking questions about what's more real, because you kind of could argue that you're looking through the model onto a real film, real place, but you could argue the opposite as well, that the only real thing is the plaster on that roof, and everything else. So it was just this sort of throwing back and forth. In a sort of different way, but again, kind of working with the experience of one place and another place, and working your way from past, present, future, backwards and forwards, is this large, like a window, a mirror window, which I installed for an exhibition in Berthe Hall in the quarry, where I've used a foil on the glass that is exactly 50% translucent, so that you were kind of, your perception was kind of instabilized, let's say. You weren't quite sure if the person in the reflection, I think there's a better image here, if they were behind you or on the other side of the glass. And that's kind of something I anticipated, but not to that extent, that people would really sort of go back and forth quite a lot. So it became a sort of odd thing where you just had to see it again, and then you had to see it again. Yeah, and then often, obviously, you'd just sort of be by yourself and they wouldn't quite do the same. But I did it in a very symmetrical landscape with this quarry being the same. Anyway. Just very briefly, this was my proposal for the fourth plinth, which is not been realized and will not be realized on it, but it was really also, again, looking at sightlines and how we perceive our movement in relationship to what's on there. I deliberately made it way too big and not straight and floating above it. I didn't really want to sort of go with the convention of putting something straight and neatly on the plinth. So one thing you discover as you go circumnavigate it or go underneath it on the steps would be that you see the map of Britain, which defines the sort of cropped outline underneath, but from the distance all you see is the sort of mountain range relating to the National Gallery behind. But now, finally, I did some work before I went to the Headlands in San Francisco and did a residency there. I did some work kind of already heading that way, that I was interested in the sort of technology of Babbage with the clay pot and the sound recordings, but more so, I'll come back to that one, with the flight recorders. I probably, out of this sort of body of work, I did the flight recorders before I went out to America, but being interested in this sort of, how shall I put it today? It's kind of the relationship of humans, not to nature, but to technology, and how human that technology eventually still is, and that the information taken from a flight recorder is subjective and human at the end of the day, even though they claim and are supposedly very objective recorders of information. And what interested me was how we still superimpose what we kind of want to read into it and out of it into that information. So I was around that time looking at a lot of this sort of layering of disguises and how with these images, how the quite obvious diffusing and deleting of these planes makes them more potent and more dangerous somehow, or they talk more about what they really are. So there was a set of photos I found in the charity shop, and I just sort of probably exactly parallel to that made these the flight recorder projects, and just wondered how can I do this in a two-dimensional image and talk about a similar thing where the hiding actually reveals more, and the sort of suggestions it makes are sort of more sinister probably than if you just see the photo of the aircraft. And let me just see what else I've got on that one. This one is not totally different to the latest one, but probably because I find this so kind of sinister. It's probably more sinister than all the other ones. And the way there's a sort of questioning of fate and faith and a lot of things, and I've really enjoyed doing that. So it's one of those ongoing strands of things that I do alongside everything else. And with the residency in the Headlands and having access to a former missile site, I sort of totally sort of sidetracked from my interest in the fog and the landscape outside there, and got very absorbed in trying to find out all the stories and human relationships to that technology through the veterans there. But so these rubbings that are in the gallery now as reprinted scans really, because no wall is ever big enough for these very large missiles. They're 13 meters long. Well, it's almost big enough. Sorry. We're nearly, but there's something, obviously to me, they sort of, to have a secondary print is something quite different, but still, I think in some way, normally that kind of room with that kind of wall makes them still appear really, really rather big. So this was my studio next to the missile site, which was wonderful. I was really lucky to get this beautiful space. So let me just see. I haven't got the photo where I'm sitting on top of the missile, sorry. But basically, that's practically what made sense in the end, to have the paper on top of them and work my way down them. And because I spent quite a bit of time over there, they let me go and work whenever I wanted, basically, which was a real privilege to sort of be able to get the missile heads, and barometric missile heads are normally locked away, and I wasn't really supposed to, but I took rubbings of them. So there's a lot of other pieces that are obviously not here, but it was just very interesting to have the conversation with the guy who ran the place as well, to sort of hear weird stories about this radar killing swarms of birds by sending out these really strong radar rays. Radar rays? Sorry, but these radars were on top of the mountain, communicating, sort of scanning the air, plus communicating down to the control rooms, etc. So I took a rubbing of that one as well, and in some way the whole idea of doing the rubbings was really related to the frustration of thinking that the photographs are just not representing it well enough. They're not big enough. They just sort of they're almost too curiously looking like deep sea fish or something. There had to be a way to record their sort of physical presence. So I took the rubbings. And moving on fast, I will open. I need to be open for some questions with this. The Arctic, yeah. I suppose with reading the text in the beginning, I don't need to explain too much, but I essentially went out to do two things, to work my way backwards in the sort of history of photography, taking high-definition digital cameras, and then work my way through less high-definition to analog Polaroids, pinholes, and some cameras in between. The other quest, if you like, was sort of trying to find that untouched nature that wasn't quite there anymore. So I spent 1 month out there, the first week with a writer, Gretel Ehrlich from California. She's sort of probably got me to want to go to Greenland in the first place, because I not only met her and read a few of her books, but there was this sort of really interesting way. She navigated her way through a very poetic way of writing and a very politically engaged life with National Geographic and sitting in on United Nations conferences and all sorts of things. She's a very amazing person. So she then agreed to sort of introduce me to some of these hunters and spent the first week with me going out onto the sea ice and getting truly away from any grids, but also then she had to leave and go back to America. And I had the opportunity to spend 2 weeks going off on other trips to sort of go the furthest possible point north, go into a fjord to record an iceberg that is responsible for the sculpture in the townhouse. These are just some sort of snaps, if you like. We were sort of camping on the ice, and I, in certain places, took pinholes when I was sort of gradually running out of electricity and charge. You can't go out there unless you're equipped with sort of certain amount of kit, petrol for the primus heaters and stoves and kayaks. They needed, of course, to go hunting with harpoons and kayaks while they were in their bag at that point, uselessly. They're having mobile phones and Sony cameras, etc. So it was, for me, really interesting to see the physicality of living in the museum on one level, but at the same time being quite contemporary about it. It's really interesting how they still have bone-carved harpoon spear things and try to ring their wife at home. It just seems such a curious overlap of exactly using the stuff that they've been using for 4,000 years and finding as well, no matter, I had all this sort of amazing Arctic clothing from Canada and all sorts of places. It was very quickly obvious that it was better to just, we borrowed their polar bear pants and their skins, and everything was the only thing that was really truly warm. So in a way, we just sort of turned into exactly sort of looking like everybody else. So just after that was sort of the main hunting base, and there was very little left afterwards. They really did take everything, pretty much. This is some of the pinholes that I also have in the exhibition. It wasn't the easiest thing to also not keep check of what's actually on the paper, because I took paper to expose and just kept it in light-tight bags and processed it all at home, sort of in my bathroom, not knowing which one is which or anything. So that was quite an odd process. And then I took a lot of Polaroids. And one of the first projects, or the biggest project that's come out of it, was to make this slice of an iceberg that was humanly, domestically tamed into a door frame, which is in the exhibition here. But it was initially measured to fit precisely through this one door, where there was literally 5 millimeters space. And in a way, that notion of cropping it and fitting it into our perception or space was what made it sort of for me interesting to make. I couldn't just kind of justify to make a representation of an iceberg somehow. The first version, I did this weird thing with having the films in the back of it, which I've changed since. There are 2 films. I've got the funny feeling we will not have time to look at any more films. So there's basically, I think you just might have the opportunity to go and see the installation, but there's 2 films of floating icebergs on water where I've cut them simply that the continuous flow of the icebergs on the water kind of would be there if there were enough screens. But if you just get sort of 2 screens, 1 meter apart, and you sort of imagine the rest. So it's about this sort of cropped image and cropped access to information, landscape, and everything else. I probably will not start the conversation about the transatlantic internet cable because you have that tomorrow anyway. Because James is going to talk about that. But in a way, that was already starting around way before then, that I was looking at how the internet cable is kind of, that we rely on, is actually going through the very deep sea and so on, while I was talking to a deep sea marine biologist who gave me all this footage of this very particular expedition where they charted and mapped an underwater mountain range, which was obviously right up my street. There was this sort of mountain range, hundreds of meters, thousands of meters below, and they made a map of it and researched everything else in the meantime. So one of the projects in the basement, in the deep sea basement, I don't think I've really clearly explained what I'm doing in the townhouse, have I, Celia? Maybe this is the point. In the Regency Town House, there was this sort of invitation or brief to make an exhibition that's related to the domestic in some way. And so it did take a little while to sort of figure out why I was actually chosen for this, because if maybe Kindertonlieder, but if anything, my work really was much more looking at open spaces and the landscape rather than the domestic. But obviously they were domesticized in the tank, so I kind of started to develop that framing it into the building, into the house. So the house becomes a geophysical slice, if you like. Domesticized landscape, if you want. So in the basement is all this deep sea footage. In the ground floor, the main piece is the iceberg, and in the top floor is sky and sun images of the Arctic sky. Now, if this is going to work, I don't know. You see, this is the one where, I don't know. This one is the one that misbehaves sometimes. Maybe, what was the trick? This is one of the films where I've overlaid sound. It's not doing it. One thing I did with the, oh, it is actually. Maybe it was just because the sound is really quiet at that point. But one of the things I've done, decided pretty soon, because the films come totally silent from the remotely operated vehicles, the ROVs attached with, normally they have 3 cameras going down, but they are absolutely silent films. And in a way, I really found it difficult to find, other than choose the footage, to actually edit it was something that I found quite tricky. And there is a couple of pieces where I sort of choreographed some of it to music and sound. Or with this one, just overlaid helicopter flight sounds over that footage, which makes it quite believable that you're physically kind of in that space, which is 3,600 meters below the surface. And what often happens with those lasers as well is that they pick up on the clouds and the sort of stirred up sands that you get that look very cloud-like. Well, they are kind of clouds. I felt they were quite reminiscent of John Martin paintings or these sort of apocalyptic landscape paintings with often the sort of red, whatever, volcano or inferno type color in them, but they're so piercing and they're constant and they're always there. So I'll skip across this. It's just, I kept them in a way. This is sort of the opposite of the Regency Town House. This is a museum. This is kind of setting dialogues up with historical canvases, and really good fun to sort of edit and choose. And basically, this is the exhibition in Trondheim that's on now till August still. But when we hung the show, we rehung the whole museum basically, and we spent 2 or 3 days in the basement picking paintings or sculptures to go with different projects. Something I've never done, but I've totally enjoyed. The sort of luxury of having a great collection in the basement. Just go, here, we'll have this. And here, let's have the Bruegel next to that one. But of course, there's this sort of very museal, totally different atmosphere to what's happening in which you will see. Or this was actually, if there was anything ever as complete as your room upstairs, there was the photos and the radar rubbing. Fantastic big space. So, and they have the full length, but they're still just printed, not the original. No, I was just going to say those wide gallery walls are sort of, you couldn't be more opposite with this, which is this wonderful setting for some of these pieces. I think I'm really happy with how the sort of derelict state of the townhouse is just perfect for a lot of it. I think it's a difficult thing because it's, of course, you don't need to do that much. It's very atmospheric. It's very full of histories and but it's just at that sort of point of restoration where it's a really interesting context to put things into, I think. So thank you for having that work in there, because it's really nice to see it not in a white space for a change. And even though the pink is a bit weird in that room, the mirror is great. It sets up a whole different sort of notion of the space continuing, and the idea of the crop and the edges of everything. They sort of don't quite work with the mirror because it kind of keeps going on. For those who haven't been in the townhouse, this is just to get some sense. Have I had this twice there? Anyway, so we did the sky images. I feel like I'm really under pressure now with the time, but maybe we should open this up for questions. But I'll just show you some stills of the videos at least, because it will be very easy for you to go down and see them. The sound of this, I suppose, significantly would be a sound that I've chosen by Peter Vasks, who wrote it for outer space, and somehow it interested me to use a composition that was really with something completely else in mind, but it still relates to this sort of open, black, endless space, to sort of transport that into the deep sea, where apart from anything it's not that dark at all, because you're right behind the torchlight. But it's this sort of slightly sort of Sisyphusian kind of activity of scooping up sand for sampling debris and material from the deep sea, but I've looped it so that it kind of scoops it all up and then spits it all back out again. But in a way, I just wanted to set up different layers of another space and a bigger space and a smaller space with that sound. But the other pieces are sort of, it's a variety of different soundtracks, I suppose, but what happens with all the little ones, which they all filming residues of human fishing technology, if you want, on the very, very deep seabeds, abandoned ghost nets and cables and the lobster pot and so on. So I've, on that one, overlaid sounds of the interior that I was sort of editing the film in, which was cars going on the outside, clock ticking in the corner, and my heartbeat, because I wanted to have somehow a sense of we can only see this on the ship or at home on the computer, and I've looked at it with Alex in his office in Oxford, and there is always that sense of physically being somewhere totally else while you see these images. And even though you know where they are, you get them in that context, and I just thought for me that was kind of important thing to do, and it was a sort of tricky thing to use music with this in some way, because I suppose that's why I kept putting on the helicopter sound as well, to disrupt this sort of too easy reading of something that is quite visually quite amazing. Now, this is just a still of the cable, and this is the one that I'm going to end on while you ask me lots of questions. This is the black smokers endlessly spewing out sulfurs and all sorts of poison, but looking amazing. Anyway, at this point, I think I've probably talked far too much, and I think maybe there's a question or two.
Yeah, we do have a few minutes for questions. I'm just going to put some lights on the back just so we can see you all. Because we would like to see you all. I want to sit with you, Mariele. So yeah, we do have a few minutes for questions. Before I hand over to you, I do have a personal question that I would like to ask Mariele. Not a personal question, of course.
Fire away.
Although we're having a lot
Anything.
We did have a lot of fun at the opening, didn't we?
We did.
There was one question I wanted to ask you, and I think it was something you brought up about the missiles when we were talking to them about them together before the actual show opened. But I see it in your other work as well, sort of this duality, and I think it appears within your interest in heterotopias and reflection. It appears in the missiles, male and female, upstairs, which you didn't talk about tonight, but I know it's something that's important to you. I just wondered if you could say a little about that sort of...
Well, there is certainly with the male-female missiles up there, it did take me a little while to figure out that, to find the little details that gave away which missile was a real thing and which missile was a fake. And effectively, they all existed to show off in the satellite images, sort of, we've got 12 missiles. They would not see the nuts and bolts, but in the sort of, by the time you sort of do the rubbing, you pick up former paintworks and texts that were under the top layer of the paint. You pick up all sorts of things, and then you also pick up that actually this one has got a hinge and the other one doesn't, and then I figured that only 3 of the missiles would have been potentially active. So there was this sort of odd history embedded in the stuff that you would normally probably not even, you would just presume they all were missiles, and of course they were. They all looked exactly the same, except that there was tiny little details that gave it away, that they weren't actually functioning.
And that was partly about bringing that out in the
yeah, I
graphite
mean,
rubbings.
in a way, the rubbings was not only to sort of represent them in their full 13-meter long size, but also it allowed me to zoom in and sort of pick up really tiny details. So it's kind of, again, it's this sort of duality of picking up the bigger picture, but the bigger picture was probably hidden in the tiny, tiny, weird mechanics of it.
I was kind of interested as well in this sort of scale as well, because a lot of your work is about replicas and domestication. But with the missiles, they are very much at this large sort of volume that...
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you'd thought about actually making replicas, like you talked about this sort of demonstration of their physicality being important.
What, do you mean like sculptures?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
3D missiles?
Or was that the graphite rubbings?
I don't know. I mean, I'm hesitant to say that would be for me, and if anything, I think there is a sort of layering of questions that is possibly intrigues me more if it is a representation, or it's a bit like looking at the deep sea. There's something interesting to sort of have tiny monitors of something so vast. Would I possibly consider having a huge fish tank full of a replica? No, that would be boring. Equally, to take tiny Polaroids of the Arctic, which is sort of impossible to document in any possible way. It's a similar kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I probably think it's not really about that.
No.
And if anything, it would be a very loud shouting, "I'm a sculptor" thing, because it would be, where would that be?
Yeah, because I think there's something so delicate about them as well.
And there's something more interesting in what Fiona Bunner did, for example, with those fighter jets in the Tate, polishing them up or hanging them like dead birds, or they needed to be physically the real thing. So actually remaking that as a sort of sculpture fake thing, that wouldn't quite work.
I just wanted to open it to the audience for questions, because I have one. Yes, the back.
She's saying it looked like you'd explored the tanks in kind of a lot of different ways, and you recreated them and really pushed them. But then I think you said that you stopped allowing yourself to do tanks, or you kind of moved on to the eyeball type structure.
Yeah, I mean, there was a point when I got probably a bit fed up with saying, "Oh, can we have a tank?" I thought, I'm doing films, I'm doing other things, and no, actually, I've explored it sufficiently, and it felt like there was a point when I don't like repeating myself too much. A little bit is okay. I felt like I knew what was happening now, and I had to move on. Having said that, with the spherical ones, there was new things happening, and that sort of, it was interesting enough to do 3 of them. Maybe, I don't know. I haven't ticked that off. I haven't ticked it off anyway. But there's so many other things I really want to see and do. You know, there was too much of a tank lady thing, syndrome.
Tank lady.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of your work, as you've talked about it here, feels quite morally passive. But then the exhibition upstairs, when we looked at it, felt quite morally radical. But then when you were talking about it, again, it felt more morally or ethically passive, that you were more interested in. So I'm interested. The question is, my question is, did you come at the work upstairs from quite a morally or politically radical point of view, or actually from quite a passive point of view?
I'm trying to sort of, I think when you say passive, it probably is just active in a different place, maybe. I just don't really think that it's my job to make big political sort of headline statements. In fact, it's probably something I deliberately don't want to do. To sort of, that was really brought out in that context in the Royal Academy exhibition, I think. You know, have you got a minute? How do you want to change the world? Be online? And I refuse to do that, because first of all, that's not what my work is trying to do at all. And I feel like, yes, as an artist, you do get some do get a sort of the privilege of making really loud statements, very visibly and very, very politically so, and it's great in a way when they come forward and do that, or I probably would if I would find the right moment and the right course. But I don't think the work is about that at all. There's this sort of, I would hope it's not necessarily passive, it's just doing something else. And would it be active if it was really sort of blatantly obvious, you know? I don't think it works like that. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question either, but I think it's if you look at the missile work and it might activate certain responses or thoughts, and therefore it's kind of more active there than the sort of maybe the story or the theory down here. Doesn't that mean that in a good way it's kind of provoked you to think about it in a maybe different way? And that's all I can maybe try to do, is to sort of stimulate that. I don't think it's my role to sort of make this sort of big statements in the work. That's maybe the sort of other layer where you can, like Gretel, for example, the writer, she's got so, you know, she has it's a terrible expression, I think, a voice that is heard because they know that she knows her stuff. And she's not just sort of superficially making up theories because, you know, she's kind of written too many good books. I don't know.
That's great. Yeah, sorry, I'll take Joe and then...
Just following on from that last point, actually, I think there's something about the missile photographs upstairs particularly, that have a kind of moral ambiguity to them, that does force you to question things, because they are actually beautiful photographs. And I think maybe that's what it is. I found that particularly interesting, is where those things move beyond some representation, and where they start to take a kind of point of view towards the objects that are being represented in that way, in that particular way, and why. And what was the process that you chose to kind of produce those photographs in that way, to play with that kind of aesthetic beauty that's inherent in something so destructive?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And it's the sort of, it's the question with beauty. You know, there's so many pairings of in the sublime, even in the contemporary sublime, that you have beauty and then you have terror, and they somehow wouldn't exist without each other. They're interlinked, and you wouldn't probably see one without the other. And a lot of the sort of romantics worked very much with that, sort of the grimy side of the sublime.
Yes. Yes, I'm sorry.
I was really interested in what you were saying about kind of cropping and the kind of selecting of the moment in the landscape. And I was just interested how you relate the pictures that you take, where you you frame part of the landscape, and something like this, which is footage that you're working with that's already been taken, or with images that echo back to framing that's already been done by romantic painters. And yeah, I was just interested in how you would select what images to follow here, and if there's something.
Well, it's actually maybe something that, the first thing that comes to my mind, and if you looked at it together, those sky images, they are fairly obvious crops around the sun being in the middle, usually kind of middle. But by putting them together like that and superimposing that line, it just indicates a whole different sense of time. And I think the cropping is physically often in the sculpture or in the 2D image, trying to allude to time going on somewhere. And this is what I was probably thinking of with the sort of the line being intentionally, it was the sort of condensation strip, but one of the visitors the other day said that it was a pendulum to her. That it was just this kind of movement of a pendulum going through them all. And I really like that. And I haven't really thought of that myself, actually, because they are obviously not condensation strips, and there's some indication of the grid or the cable or a pendulum that just keeps moving, and it's just kind of cropped in a way that you just can't catch it really, or it makes that crop very specific, but at the same time quite random, and it's all those kind of odd things. Yeah, but obviously the cropping happens in pretty much all those, and it's either me superimposing it onto it or picking it because it's already cropped.
Okay. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you will join me in thanking Mariele Neudecker for a fantastic talk this evening.